Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features, or ideas on how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Compañeros, welcome to episode 90. And we have a exciting guest. Always have exciting guests here on the episode, but we have a return visitor with us today.
Yes, indeed. This week's guest is Sean McCown, and the topic IBI and how to run it in lots of places all at once.
Yeah, that's right. This is one of the things that Sean has been working a little bit about. He has a tool that he's been working on that we'll share with you a little bit later on in the program. But Sean is always an interesting character to talk with. He was on episode 41, which we talked a little bit about index maintenance. And so we get into basically the idea of why we should be running DBCC CheckDB and then some of the issues that we have because we run it and how to solve for those.
Right.
So that's kind of the topic for today.
And this week's episode ran a little bit longer than our typical episode, but it wasn't quite long enough to split it into two episodes. So if you like the longer episode or you don't like the longer episode, let us know what you think. We're always looking for feedback. Let us know what you think. We're always looking for feedback on that.
And now let's do a little SQL Server in the news. So Jovan Popovic, who I believe is still the program manager for the JSON in SQL Server, he put out an article that I thought was interesting, and it happened to coincide with an interview that I was doing with the Ruby Rogues folks, so the Ruby language, open source. And his article was on how data access libraries can affect the performance that you get from SQL Server.
Oh, yes, indeed. I mean, this is one I know I've seen in the past, because anytime you start changing what's going on between your display code and the core of the database, I mean, any number of things can go on in there. They could have a big difference on your overall performance.
Yeah, so this was of interest to me, and not something that I don't think I've...
Number of things can go on in there. They could have a big difference on your overall performance.
Yeah, so this was of interest to me, and not something that I don't think I've paid enough attention to in the past, particularly with talking with the Ruby folks. So I was talking with Ken Collins, who's put out the protocols or the way that you can connect Ruby to SQL Server. And we're familiar with ODBC, TCP/IP. We see the named pipes, in there. Those are connections that we're familiar with. He's using the DB library, which is older than the ODBC that we get, but it hasn't changed very much. And that's what he was using. And so kind of talking with him and learning about that in preparation for that podcast episode, I thought, and then seeing this article, there are lots of different ways that developers are using to connect. And it never really crossed my mind that it could then have an impact on what their experience was with that data.
That you're able to even connect and do anything.
Exactly.
and sometimes it might make more sense to look at what are the other options that you have from that language, and then do a little bit of performance testing and see how things work. And maybe one way works better than the other.
No, exactly. And so that's actually references in his tool, or in the post rather, that it's the Stack Exchange Dapper tool. And then he uses a couple of different connection methods. So again, kind of in the .NET framework, he's looking at using connection strings like hard-coded with the database libraries. He's looking at, or the data readers rather, entity framework with database.sql query, and an entity framework with link. And again, we'll have the post on the show notes for today's episode, but I thought it was worth a gander. And again, just kind of a way to, it opened my eyes to say, gosh, This is something that I need to be more educated about as more and more people, particularly with the migration of SQL Server to I need to be more educated about as more and more people, particularly with the migration of SQL Server to Linux. We're going to have more people wanting to connect to the database or more types of applications, and I think it's something that we're going to have to at least be familiar with and be able to speak to, particularly when we're looking at like an entity framework type model.
Yep. And I know all those different frameworks or tools for connecting are there to make it easier for the developer, but they don't always point out what the performance implications are.
Exactly. So again, we'll have that article, and I think it's worth checking out and taking a peek. And again, they have the tool so that you can then test your own connections there.
Yep. Okay, so as far as shout-outs this week, I think one of the things we wanted to mention, this is sort of a multi-shout-out, and that's to all the people who have given us feedback on the conference and help us with what we're doing to shape and build the SQL Compañero conference, as well as from speakers who are joining the lineup, which you'll have in a few weeks as we announce those.
That's right.
And where can people find out more about that, Carlos?
Yeah, so the conference URL is compañeroconference.com. We've really just kind of been introducing this and trying to get our feet wet, if you will, with the way the lineup should be, what we should be talking about, and then, of course, onboarding the speakers and nailing down that agenda. And so we've appreciated everyone that's provided some feedback and kind of indicated what they'd want to learn and talk about in a conference setting like this.
Yep. And I think it's one of those things that's important when you're looking at what conference you're going to go to is knowing when you sign up who's going to be presenting. And that's the thing that we're really working on getting hammered out over the next couple of weeks.
That's right. And so as we were looking at this, one of the other things that came up is the end of the quarter. We were kind of reviewing things, and March was one of our best months from downloads. So thank you, everyone. We appreciate it. And we have a little bit of a rivalry going here.
Yes, we do. So one of the things that some of the guests have commented on is how they will make their episode one of the best episodes ever. And I know we've had a recent episode that was up and coming very quickly through the ranks and has now become our best or our most downloaded episode to date. And that was our indexing episode, episode 1 of the indexing with Randolph West. And what was I don't remember the episode number on that one, Carlos.
So episode 81.
Episode 81.
Episode 81 with Randolph West. We ended up breaking that conversation up into 2 episodes, so 81 and 82. And he now holds that place as the highest number of downloads. And we think we have a couple of challengers that could come and snag that away.
Yep.
And so we're excited about some of the things that we will be talking about.
Yep.
And we also wanted to give a shout out to James Yocanis. And thanks to James again for chiming in with some of these ideas. You've been very good about chiming in with some of these. And so he has an idea for an episode on talking about the SQL Server plan cache reuse, which I think would be very interesting. Lots of tentacles in that conversation. And could be the one to dethrone Randolph there.
Could be. And, that's one of those, the whole plan cache reuse. There's been so much confusion over the years between DBAs and developers and on what exactly plan cache reuse is. And I think that would be a fun episode to do. So perhaps you'll see something coming your way soon.
That's right. And again, do be patient with us because it does take time to line all this stuff up. But we did want to mention, James, that we got it. So I think for those of you who don't know Sean, are the head honchos over at MinionDB. And they've put together a number of tools, are very active in the community. Always very interesting to talk to, and we're very glad that Sean was willing to come on and talk with us a little bit about DBCC CheckDB.
Yes, and that's one of those, one of my favorite topics is DBCC CheckDB, and I think that it's hard to squeeze it into that normal 30-minute time slot. So although we've gone a little bit long, I think there's a lot of great content there.
Yes, I haven't been using that name as often as I wanted to, but, you as the compañero, or the corruption compañero, rather, would be very interested in what the results of that guy are. And so we get into a little bit of that. And I think, very interesting conversation.
Yep.
The show notes for today's episode are available at SQLDataPartners.com/CheckDB.
Or at SQLDataPartners.com/episode number. And this is episode
90.
90.
So I guess with that, let's go ahead and jump into the conversation with Sean. Sean, welcome to the program.
Thanks, guys.
Yes, nice to have you back. Episode 41, you were with us. Since then, we made a couple of changes, added Steve to the program, and it's nice of you to come back and chat with us.
Is this my second or third time on?
I thought it was just the second time.
It's possible.
Yeah. You're just a popular guy, right? You're just everywhere, here and there, everywhere.
Oh, God, I wish.
Well, so today we're going to go backwards a little bit, and we're going to be talking about a command, and then we're going to back into the why we want to be using it and some of the issues around it. So our conversation is going to focus on DBCC CheckDB.
Ooh, one of my favorites.
There you go.
An oldie, but
And that's right. The infamous, or what? No.
an oldie, but
And that's right. The infamous, or what made, maybe not what made him, but definitely what added to what Paul Randall is today. He likes to frequently give credit for building the CheckDB command, at least the original one. I think it's gone through some iterations since then.
I mean, he rebuilt it in 05, right? He didn't build the original one that I'm aware of. He just did the major overhaul in SQL 05, right?
The way I remember him telling the story was that he and his team built it originally.
Oh, see, I think what I had heard was closer to what Sean was saying, that it was
Okay.
a redo of it in
Gotcha.
05, which
Yeah, because he was always talking about how it was really messy and how a bunch of the error messages were kind of foobarred and they didn't really give much info on how he went through and straightened all that stuff out in 05.
Gotcha. Okay, well then there you go. So I stand corrected. So he made it a little bit better. So ultimately, the question is, why would we be wanting to run the DBCC CheckDB
Go question. The lightest answer is because, stuff happens, right? When you're dealing with media, and typically magnetic media, all kinds of things can go wrong in those writes. Whether those things that go wrong cause writes, whether those things that go wrong come from the magnetic media themselves or some kind of memory corruption. Sometimes, CPU errors can cause things. I mean, since you can't physically see it, right? It's not like sending out a tray of food where you can see that the hors d'oeuvres are in disarray, right?
Sure.
See it, then you need something to tell you when things aren't right, or you're going to be making, very bad decisions, and you need something that helps you fix them too. I mean, people take that kind of thing for granted, but it's just as important now as it ever was.
So then with the CheckDB process, when you say when things aren't right, I mean, what type of things are going to pop up that aren't right that you're going to know about because of CheckDB?
So did you say what are some of the problems that you wouldn't know about because of it?
No. What are the things that you're going to find out about when you run CheckDB if you had problems that you maybe hadn't run it in the past?
Right. So you can have problems with like out of range errors, right? So you get like in the lower versions of SQL, I haven't seen that kind of thing as much. So the data purity, right?
Right.
So that used to be a really big thing when I was doing upgrades from like 7.0 to 2000 and from 2000 to 05 and maybe even a little bit in 05, but it was a lot better then, where you'd go to upgrade and you start getting all these PK violations, right? Because they didn't do such a good job at checking primary keys. And, there are things just flat out like, page linking problems where, same thing happens, right? 2 pages don't get linked properly and therefore, when you go to run a query, it can't find the data it needs and you get an error because the link that it has on the page doesn't point to anywhere. And of course, there are the same problems with index pages as well, right? Those are clearly the easier ones to find. And then, of course, there are your disastrous ones where you've got problems in the system pages for the database itself. But yeah, it's of those problems, right? And I mean, Steve, you're a big CheckDB guy, so you know all about that kind of stuff.
When I see that, oftentimes people are either not running CheckDB at all, or they're not running it frequent enough. And I guess frequent enough is one of those sort of variable terms. But I mean, how often should people really, and from your perspective, should people be checking their databases with CheckDB?
There's actually a third one there. People, they don't run it at all, they don't run it often enough, or they run it and they don't check the results.
Sure.
That's a really big one. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that more later. But as far as how often should they be running it, man, that varies so much, right? I mean, what does often enough mean? I would say if you've got a smallish database, where you've got plenty of resources and really you're not in danger of affecting a workday, right? I mean, you're not going to hurt anything, right? It's not like reindexing where it's actually going to, where you could actually mess stuff up, right?
Yep.
So
then let's say, though, you've got a much larger database and it's really not feasible to run it that frequent.
As often as you can.
Yep. So I've had the conversation sometimes where people say, well, we can only afford to run it once a month on each database because things are just too big. And one of the things I commonly see there is that, well, maybe they're running it once a month, but they only have 3 weeks of full backups. And if they're doing something like that, they might not have backup history far enough to go back to where that last good CheckDB was.
Right.
And how would you come back and, I don't know, with that? If somebody was telling you that, how would you address that?
Are you baiting me?
Because no, it's one of those things that comes up in conversation. And I'm just saying,
I know.
What would your take be on that with that? If somebody was telling you that, how would you address that?
Are you baiting me?
Because no, it's one of those things that comes up in conversation. And I'm just saying,
I know.
What would your take be on that when somebody can't run it? I mean, it's so infrequent that they don't have a backup period long enough to go back and...
I know that. I'm just asking if you're baiting me because that's one of the big situations that I was adamant about handling in Minion CheckDB. Yep. And so I wondered if you were baiting me into seeing how long I could go without saying Minion CheckDB.
So let me jump in here, I guess, just for a second, right? So as the knuckle dragging Neanderthal of the panel here, we've talked about some of these different scenarios, right? I don't think we explicitly called out corruption, although I think all of the scenarios that you listed could be classified as a corruption type issue.
Oh, of course.
Yep.
The constraint or the reason people don't want to run it, we talk about impact.
Right.
Because it has to read everything, don't we kind of get into
as much? No, usually the pressure I've seen for CheckDB isn't as much memory as it is disk. And some CPU thrown in there as well, depending on how much CheckDB is going to multi-thread if you're on enterprise. But I would say that the bigger issue is probably going to be something like snapshot space for your disk. I haven't personally ever run out of memory when running a CheckDB.
What I mean by that is that the reason I can't run it, I'm going to affect my applications because now I'm flushing things out of the buffer cache that I need for my application because I'm running CheckDB.
No, because it's going to take an internal snapshot and it really runs it against that internal snapshot. So when we say it's going to affect external applications, it's going to be through CPU and disk. So let's say that one of the big scenarios, especially on a really busy system, will affect external applications. It's going to be through CPU and disk. So let's say that one of the big scenarios, especially on a really busy system with a really big database, is that it's going to run for quite some time. Let's say it takes 5 or 6 hours to run a CheckDB, which not only isn't all that uncommon, it's really not all that long for a really big database. And if you don't have enough disk space, then you're going to expand that snapshot. It's going to keep expanding until it fills up the disk, and then either it's going to crash or it's going to keep your database from being able to expand when it needs to, and then you're going to halt your processes and start rolling stuff back. So that and some CPU area, but maybe Steve knows something about this that I don't, but I just don't see flushing the buffer as being as big of a deal because it is running against that snapshot.
Obviously, there's something about this process that I do not understand. When I hear snapshot, right, I'm generally think about I'm making not necessarily a copy, but as things change, I'm going to keep the history of that, and then the database continues, and then my snapshot grows larger as more changes happen to the database.
Correct.
This is what happens when I'm running DBCC CheckDB?
Yes. Only it's an internal snapshot that SQL itself runs, right?
Right.
It creates a snapshot behind the scenes for you.
So depending on the frequency of change to my database, then that snapshot is going to increase, and that is what's going to cause me the disk outage that you mentioned.
Correct. And Steve was trying to say something in the background there. I'm really interested in what he was going to say.
So what I was going to get at there was around the whole squeeze on memory like Carlos was talking about. The thing I've seen is when you've got a system where the database is significantly larger than what can fit in memory, and queries are generally being run that are doing their best they can to deal with the page life expectancy and keep the right things are staying in memory for them to run, where it grows and grows and grows and grows until that CheckDB job runs. And then that pushes everything out because everything's needing to be loaded in to be scanned.
Right.
And the page life expectancy drops to 0 when that CheckDB runs. I look at that usually as an indication that it'd be good to add more memory to the system. However, that's not always feasible in all environments.
Okay. Basically, it can affect the 3 biggies, right? It can affect memory, CPU, and disk. But disk, obviously, because we're going to pull that whole entire database off of the disk, and the snapshotting process, I'm getting reads and writes. So that's probably the biggest concern, or the first concern, potentially.
Right, but I really don't think it pulls in the entire database at once. It probably goes up.
Oh, sure.
No, it'll bring it in page by page, just as
Right.
pages would be normally used. But as it's doing that, it's pushing out something that hasn't been used for a little bit through the normal buffer pool process. Doing that, it's pushing out something that hasn't been used for a little bit through the normal buffer pool process.
Sure.
And you end up pushing a lot of pages out in that process that may have been reused had CheckDB not been run.
Right.
Sure. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to lead to memory pressure.
I wasn't saying that it's going to push it to the point you're running out of memory. I'm just saying it's pushing it to the point that you're causing a lot more I/O because things have been pushed out of memory to make room for what's being brought in when CheckDB gets run.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in certain scenarios, would it be fair to say that in a sense you could compare that similar to almost like a restart, right? Because all that stuff just gets pushed out. Not to that extreme.
No, I get what you're saying. Sure, let's go with that.
One of the things that comes up is that a lot of people say, I can't run DBCC CheckDB in my whole database. It's just not good enough there, or it's not going to work, or what are the main reasons you see that people say that, or people are looking at, they just can't do it?
Right. So there are 2 big reasons I would say that I see for that. One of them is that disk filling up that we talked about, right? Because their database is just too big and too busy, and it won't run in significant time that the snapshot doesn't fill up.
Yep.
And that's a really big problem. I've talked to lots of people who just flat out don't run CheckDBs anymore because of that alone. And another one is that it just takes so long for it to run. Even if they can withstand the disk, it still just takes so long to run that, that's a drain on resources, right? I mean, ultimately, that is a drain on resources. And they just can't have resources drained for that long, or they...
Okay, so earlier, one of the things you mentioned was that one of the problems is that people are running CheckDB and they're not checking the results.
Right.
I know that if you kick off CheckDB in an SQL Server Management Studio window, you're going to get results that are all going to show up on red on your screen if you're interactively running it. However, if you've got it running as a job, what are your best options for knowing the failure or success of that CheckDB process?
Right. So you've got to look at the job itself, right? The job could fail itself. And all this depends on how you've written your CheckDB routine, right?
Yep.
If you're like on built-in maintenance plans, doesn't it push it to the error log? I think you see those errors in the error log, and you know.
And that's normally what I see. You run it as a job, and that's how I'm going to know that it failed. Is my job failed?
Right.
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 And I know that whether it's a maintenance plan or a job or just interactively running it, it's whenever CheckDB hits a problem, it does write to the error log.
Right.
It's a maintenance plan or a job or just interactively running it, it's whenever CheckDB hits a problem, it does write to the error log.
Right.
But there's also going to be things that show up in your job history as a failure if it's running as a job or a maintenance plan there.
Right. And now, I don't know about you guys, but I come from a lot of big environments where we've had, 1,000 servers, 2,000 servers, right? And tens of thousands of databases. I don't know about you guys, but I really, really want to search the log for something vaguely CheckDB related. every week or every day or every something. Not only that, but then go inside of there and parse the results out and try to figure out exactly what the problem was, right?
Sure.
So that's what I see most, right? The guys who have it a little bit more on the ball will run it with the table results flag, which is better because now you can at least get the table results, but you have to build in a whole process for that thing too, right? Table is better because now you can at least get the table results, but you have to build in a whole process for that thing too, right? Because that whole table results thing has to be managed, and it didn't help that for the longest time, table results was undocumented. You know, like somebody was going to bring down the server with table results or something.
Right.
So I still don't know why it was undocumented for so long. But the ones that are really on the ball will run it with table results and at least get it in a table. But like I said, you have to build a whole process around that. And it's not just as easy as, you know, I'm going to run this with the table results flag and that's it. Because I've got tens of thousands of databases now, right? And any process that I develop has to work against 1,000 and 2,000 servers with tens of thousands of databases, or it's not going to do me any good for the 5 databases I have. We're being asked as DBAs, we're being asked to do more and more and more, and to spend my time going around and checking all of these things and then parsing the results and all. Who's got time for that crap? You know,
Right.
Yeah, and that's really an interesting point there, because the thing people talk about, what's the DBA job going to be in the future? And I think that it's something that's always changing, where we're going and what we're doing with it. But I look at the people who maybe haven't changed in the last 15 years of SQL Server, and they're the kind of people who their job consists of every day looking at error logs and manually scanning those error logs and determining, are there any problems I have to deal with? Whereas the DBAs who are evolving and going forward in the future are the ones who are building the automated processes. So you don't have to manually do that.
Exactly.
You can focus on real issues rather than reading error logs.
There are 2 aspects, right? There's discovering the problem, reading the problem, solving the problem, right? And so you want this stuff to be as easy as possible, especially with corruption. You want to know about it as soon as you possibly can. Sending CheckDB results to the log is ridiculous. Hell, I think sending deadlock information to the log is ridiculous.
Yep.
What am I going to do with deadlock information in the log? I mean, I've got this XML graph kind of thing taking up 37 lines in my log. What am I going to do with that? You know, so.
Sure.
Anyway,
You want to be a little bit more proactive.
Well, not just proactive, but Microsoft needs to do a better job at making the stuff that we need to monitor accessible. One of the worst things they did in X events was make the whole thing XML driven. That was one of the worst things they could have done, because the average DBA doesn't know really anything at all about XML. And so it's great that I can take that stuff and save it to a file. Now I've got all this XML in a file, and what am I supposed to do with it? Now DBAs have to go to a 2-week course just to be able to query the XML data out of there and take that stuff and save it to a file. Now I've got all this XML in a file, and what am I supposed to do with it? Now DBAs have to go to a 2-week course just to be able to query the XML data out of there. Thanks for that. You know, I could at least import server-side trace and profiler data into a table and query it like a table, anything else, right? But here you got to jump through some major hoops to get it in the same format. So they haven't done a good job about taking the stuff that we absolutely have to have and making it really accessible to people that are managing on a large scale.
Right.
Yeah. So Steve, I'm sensing that we should have asked our SQL family question a little sooner.
Yeah, that's a good point. We'll come back to that at the end then.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep. So then I guess back to the question around, are we baiting you? And I think now's the time that we might start baiting you on. I mean, now that we've talked about CheckDB and some of the pros and cons and difficulties and challenges.
I targeted Minion CheckDB for those large shops with DBAs that are super busy, that don't have time for, you know, searching through the logs or for building their own process with, you know, table results. And also for the super large DBA or for the super large databases where you don't have time to run CheckDB. You can't run CheckDB because your database is too big. Right. So it was specifically designed with those guys in mind.
Well, so now, is it different from DBCC CheckDB? or is it using the same command, just kind of slicing it up and giving us more options?
It's all about the process, right? When the rubber hits the road, I'm still running CheckDB and CheckTable.
Okay.
But it's all about the process behind it, right? So, for instance, let's talk about one of the things that I'm particularly proud of process-wise. We'll talk about like the large database that Steve mentioned where, they just don't run CheckDB because their database is too big, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things you can do with Minion is you can set it up to do a rotating check table instead. So you can say, I want to do 5 check tables a night or 500 check tables a night until all the tables are done and then start over again. So you're doing all of the objects, right? Because what is a CheckDB really, right? Is it a CheckDB or is it the equivalent operations? Right?
Well, that's right. It's all the little pieces underneath.
Right.
And although it's more than just check table on all the tables.
Of course it is.
I think check table on all the tables gets you started on a big amount of the areas where you're most likely to have issues.
Yeah. But you can also run the other smaller operations like check alloc as well, right?
Yep.
So, if you want to check your objects and you just can't because it takes 3 days, then do a...
Yep.
So, if you want to check your objects and you just can't because it takes 3 days, then do 100 at a time, 500 at a time.
How do you get around that? Well, I'll use smaller numbers, right? So that I can wrap my head around it. So I have 10 tables.
Okay.
Right? And I can only do 5 at a time, right? So my maintenance window, let's just say, is, I can do 5 tables once a week. It's going to take me 2 weekends to get through all 10 tables.
Yes.
So when the change happens, I do 1 through 5, weekend number 1. Weekend number 2, I'm doing 6 through 10, but corruption happens in table number 1.
Right.
I'm not going to find that until the next day. I guess going back to Steve's point, I'm just going to need to take that in consideration and make sure that my backups exceed the time that I can get the total database done.
Correct. Another scenario that I do with that is I allow you to send them. So you can set it up to every single night. It will take the latest backup and restore it to a remote box and run a CheckDB on it and send the results back to the prod box.
Gotcha. Which is, would be awesome, particularly, maybe not if you have thousands, but if you're in the, 20s or, 50s maybe of databases, would be a nice way to do it.
Yeah, well, you don't do that for every database, right? I mean, every database isn't that big.
Sure. Also true.
But you do it on the ones that you can't do, and the other ones you do local. And, so, I mean, I give you 3 options, I think, for restoring your backup remotely. And I give you a number of options for the type of remote restore or the type of remote job you want to do. I mean, it's incredibly configurable with just, 3 or 4 or 5 columns worth of data, right? And permissions worked out and everything. That was the biggest thing, right? Was the permissions between the 2 servers. Once they got that worked out, they found that the process itself just runs.
So then, Carlos, going back to your example of small 10 tables, but you can only do half of them each week. And I think around that scenario, if you're only able to do half of them per week, because that's your maintenance window, if you were doing full CheckDB previously, I think the likelihood would be you're never actually doing CheckDB. So even if you're only finding out a week behind or 2 weeks behind that something's been encountered that's a problem, corruption, for instance, it's better to know about it within 2 weeks rather than never knowing about it.
Right. Or when a user tells you, hey, I'm getting this error.
Right. And you find out you had corruption 18 months ago and it just sort of crept through for that amount of time.
Yeah. Right. Well, and the cool thing is you can even set it up to run your important tables, right, every night. So you could say, I want to run these guys on a schedule, but I also want to run my really important tables every single day because these are the guys that I have to have, right? And it's really easy to exclude tables or exclude schemas or something like that. So you can really target it. And really importantly, you can order the databases and order the tables as well. So in your maintenance window, even if you're doing all of your tables at once, which is another scenario, right? We've got the concept of what do I call it? Dynamic snapshots. So getting around that problem of your snapshot file filling up, right, and just killing your CheckDB operation. Well, you can put your own snapshot on there, right? So you can create your own disk and put your own snapshot on there. But if you don't have a disk lying around that's big enough, right, you can switch to check tables. But even if you're doing your own snapshot and your own disk and put your own snapshot on there, but if you don't have a disk lying around that's big enough, right, you can switch to check tables. But even if you're doing your own snapshot and check tables, you're still going to fill that up. So with dynamic snapshots, what we do is we allow you to say, you know what? Every 30 minutes, I want you to drop the snapshot and create a new one and then continue doing the check tables. So if you're going to do 1,000 tables and it's going to take you, say, 7 hours to get through it, every half hour, it's going to drop that snapshot, assuming that it's after an operation, right? If one table takes an hour and a half, there's nothing I can do about that.
Sure.
If it's over that half hour, it'll drop that snapshot, create a new one, and then carry on with the rest of the tables. And that's going to keep you from filling up that snapshot space, that disk drive. So,
okay, gotcha.
That's another scenario that we threw in there for this big database problem, right?
Yep. So one of the scenarios, so then you run check table against that one really big table, and it ends up taking almost as long as CheckDB would have taken to begin with.
Sure.
So are there any options or anything that you see of on how you would deal with that differently?
Right. So
then perhaps run it on another server?
How important is that table?
Well, usually when it's that size, it's sort of pretty darn important, and it's just that big because some software along the way wasn't architected to correctly warehouse things or break it out into other tables.
It could just be, an archive table that's sitting there. It doesn't get data but once a day or once a week or once a month or something, right? And so it's not really that important of a table functionally. The data just needs to be there. So there are two different scenarios, right, that you're talking about. You're talking about the archive table that's just sitting there getting bigger and bloating your CheckDBs, and the one that is actually an active table that they just refuse to archive, bigger and bloating your CheckDBs, and the one that is actually an active table that they just refuse to archive. And we've all seen that, right? In that first scenario, it's really easy just to exclude that table from your check table process and only run it, say, once a month or once every 2 months or something, right? I mean, that's really easy to do. The second one is a little bit harder because, that is an active table. A couple things you can do there. You could put it in its own file group and run, check file group. I like that solution a lot less because I don't think you really gain anything from that.
Sure.
But yeah, you would either run the CheckDB remotely, or you could as well run check tables against all of the other tables every day and only save that one for like the weekend or once a month or something like that, right? That's going to take a really long time, and do that one by itself.
Yep.
Or since it's a really long time, and do that one by itself.
Yep.
Or since it's 95%, then, run a full CheckDB or full check table process on the weekend or once every 2 weeks or something. But for your dailies, or even better yet, you can give it, I want to say perfunctory, but you could run it with physical only, more often than doing the full data check, right? Just make sure that, physical only will just make sure that all the page structures and everything are proper, right? It won't bother checking any of the other data type stuff, right? So it's a much faster check because it's a lesser check, but at least you'll know that the tables themselves have integrity and not necessarily the data. And I've got somebody doing that. And by the way, that's really easy to do. And Minion is to say on Monday through Friday or on weekdays, right? I want to run this with physical only. And on Saturday, I want to run this, I want to run a full check table on it.
Yep. Okay. Another area that's come up in debate here and there as I've done things with database corruption and whatnot is around doing DBCC CheckDB on TempDB.
Right.
And that's one that I've seen a lot of really intense arguments on one way or the other of whether you should do it or whether you should not do it. And I'm really just curious what your thoughts are on checking TempDB.
Of course you should do it. TempDB is central to everything that you do, right? I mean, so much stuff uses TempDB these days. And if you're pushing all of your temp tables through there and a lot of your spill results, and you've got corruption in there, or more importantly, you've got it on a disk that is causing corruption in there, and you're going to now rely on the results from these operations, you need to know if TempDB is corrupt. I mean, what you do about it is for debate, right? Depending on what's going to happen, right? I mean, of course, the easiest thing, or the only thing you could, but yeah, to think that because it's not, that the data isn't persistent doesn't mean that it can't be creating corrupt results and just, hosing your entire environment and results and whatnot that are coming through. Perfect.
Perfect. And although I tried to ask that question in a very middle of the road state of trying to not voice my opinion one way or the other, I completely agree with your answer there. And I think that
you did a good job.
Next time I'm in an argument over this with someone, I'll say, refer back to episode 90 of the SQL Data Partners podcast, and there's a brief discussion on that.
Absolutely. You can tell them I said so. That's right.
I, of course, agree with you too, Steve, if that matters, but, I'm not sure I get a vote.
You get a vote. Yep. We just may not count it.
All right. So then I guess...
I'm not sure I get a vote.
You get a vote. Yep. We just may not count
it. All right. So then I guess back on sort of the topic of the minion CheckDB side of things.
Sure.
There's a lot of people running CheckDB. There's a lot of people running their own custom CheckDB scripts. There's people that are running the Ola Hallegren's database integrity script.
Sure.
What I'm trying to understand is who out there is going to get the most value out of the Minion CheckDB product versus one of these other ways of doing it?
I hate to sound like that way, but absolutely everybody. The amount of logging that we've thrown into this product is obscene. And I don't mean obscene in a figurative sense. I mean, it is obscene. The amount of
So you mentioned some of that, and so you kind of downplayed a little bit the role or the usefulness of going to the error log. So when you talk about reporting, what does that mean? I'm getting an email message. There's a dashboard. What does that mean?
We store everything in log tables instead of in files or in the log, right? So we make it really easy to get to.
I mean, is there built-in processing that's going to notify me like, hey, dummy, your biggest table has corruption in it?
We don't get into the alerting business at this level, right? We save that for our enterprise product. Wink, wink, wink. But because I don't know how you want to alert, right? But I've made it as simple as possible. I mean, there's even a flag that says to fail the job, right? Because we handle all of the errors, the job won't fail. So you have to tell it specifically, I want to fail the job. Some people don't want the job to fail. Some people have a separate process that go out there. So there are network monitors that can consume SQL queries, right? Or maybe you want to add a separate step to the job that just queries the table and says, email me if, any errors occurred. But, the point is that we give you the errors in a very consumable state. Long it took. We tell you what the last status was. We tell you, whether it was a remote job or not. We tell you what server it ran on. We give you an obscene amount of information. There are probably 40 or 50 columns in our log details table.
Gotcha. Okay.
Log for absolutely everything. And I would say that that's the biggest advantage that we have over everybody else is, again, in that process, in the processing of the information and the jobs, because we even allow you to do things like, let's say that you've got even, that you're using, say, Ola, and you've got, 300 databases on a server, and they're all relatively medium size, right? Well, you have to do all those serially, right? Or you have to create 5 or 10 different jobs and then put 10 or 20 of them at a time in the parameters, right?
Do the legwork to carve it up yourself.
To split that up so that you can run those concurrently, right? Well, you can just to split that up so that you can run those concurrently, right? Well, you can just, Minion is already multi-threaded, so you just say run 10 at a time, and it'll split them up and it'll run 10 at a time.
That begs the question, when are you introducing problems by doing so many at the same time?
It's like resource-wise?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
When is too many too many?
That's going to depend on your server and everything involved, right?
That's fair.
I gave you a fully automatic machine gun What you choose to shoot with it is your problem. One thing I despise is tools that try to be smarter than me, right?
Gotcha. Sure.
I may not ever use a multi-threaded process because this one big server won't support it most of the time. But then there's this one time when we're down for our quarterly maintenance and they say, you've got 2 hours to do it while we do all of this other stuff on our app boxes, right, that hit the SQL box.
Right.
And I'll say, okay, I'm going to run 5 CheckDBs at once and get them all done in 2 hours.
Gotcha.
Because I've got the box to myself. You may not use that normally, but you may use it 3 or 4 times a year when something like that comes up. And, there's just so much other stuff in there, right? You can do the same thing with, that same rotation we talked about with check tables, right? Where you can do a set of tables and then do another set of tables and then do another set of tables, right? You can do CheckDBs that way too. So you could rotate through those 300 databases, 10 a week or 10 a night. Or you could say, you can also run it based off of time. You can say, I want to run CheckDBs for an hour a night, and then just pick up where you left off with the next database tomorrow. And then, so it'll just roll through all of those guys on a timed basis as well.
In that scenario, does it keep the snapshot? I'm getting a new snapshot, right? If it has to, I need 2 nights to get through the whole database.
Right.
I'm getting a new snapshot, right?
So it depends.
Oh, okay.
If you're running timed CheckDBs, which only work off of a rotation, which makes sense if you think about it, then it's only going to run the CheckDBs that it can do in that time. You can't CheckDB half a database. Gotcha.
Okay, gotcha.
But if you're running check tables, then it'll run through as many of the tables in an hour as it can.
Right. Okay.
And then in the snapshot settings, if you're creating your own snapshot, that is, right? If it's an internal snapshot, you have no say there. But if you're creating your own snapshot, then you can tell it to leave the snapshot there or to delete the snapshot when it's done, and then you'll just get another one tomorrow. So you've got options there.
Another question I had, and this goes to something. I want to say it was Grant Fritchie said it. It's given me a little bit of heartburn. That is when we have corruption, a little bit of heartburn. That is when we have corruption. His comment was, you want to find out why it happened.
Sure.
And this kind of goes back a little bit into our TempDB discussion, and you mentioned the disks, right? So my question is, how do you normally go about identifying why corruption happens?
I would say that depends, right?
Okay.
There are a number of things that can cause corruption. I'm going to say, in my experience, most of the time it's going to be a spinning disk.
Okay.
But, it can be caused by you, say, copying a database over the wire and it gets corrupted and the bits get corrupted over the wire. Or you've got bad memory and the memory's starting to go out, and that'll do it too. I would say disk and memory are the top 2, but I see disk way more often. So...
Sure. I think I've also seen one scenario. I guess a client called me up. They had some corruption, and they were trying to do like a big bulk import, and I don't know exactly what happened, but it sounded like somebody just pushed a button to power down, hard stopped the machine.
Right.
And something like that caused the problem as well.
Right, and that can usually be boiled down to probably something being written incorrectly to the disk.
Right, so some kind of transaction error or something.
Right, so to answer your question directly, I kind of prefaced it there.
Sure.
So to answer your question directly, usually if I find like a corrupt table, I'll go on and fix it and just kind of move on, but I'll watch it, right?
Okay.
Because things happen, right? Sure. Stuff happens. But if I see another corruption within a reasonable time, say another month, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe 2, then I'll say, okay, we need to figure out, because we've gotten 2 corruptions inside of a few weeks, and this is just too often. So I'll have one of the guys run a disk check, and then I'll have them run a memory check, right? Mm-hmm. So this is just too often. So I'll have one of the guys run a disk check, and then I'll have them run a memory check, right? Mm-hmm. So you need to specifically check the disk and specifically check the memory to make sure that they're okay. Because you're right, you do need to know where it's coming from. And I'm going to say most of the time it's going to be disk.
Yep.
But the thing is, I've had them come back before and say, well, the disk came back clean. And I'm like, well, that's great, but you've corrupted 3 tables this week. I had this conversation with somebody 6 months ago. But you've corrupted 3 tables this week. The disk is not okay. Well,
Right.
well, we just ran a full disk check. Well, either run it again or run a different check because you're not okay. After going back a few rounds with them, they would get with the vendor who would either show them a different way to do it or give them a different tool, and bam, the bad sectors show up.
Sure. There's some flag or some option that they didn't have before that.
Right. Check the controller, right? It could be the controller as well, but something corrupt on its own. It doesn't just get tired. So you need to stick to your guns and don't let them come back and say, oh, well, we didn't find anything. Because you know what? I have found quite often that when they say they do something, you're like disk guys and network guys, oh, well, we didn't find anything. They actually didn't look.
Right.
I've seen
that brings up an interesting story where I worked with a client a couple years ago where, there was no reason that they could see that they were getting corruption, and it just happened. And then after looking into it a little bit more, well, it turned out that it just happened because their SQL server was running under a desk without any kind of UPS or any kind of backup or anything like that. And every time there was a lightning storm or a power outage or any kind of problem, it would basically just completely power the whole thing off.
Yep.
And surprise, surprise, magically you just corruption at that point.
I had that same problem. One of my first DBA gigs.
Really power the whole thing off.
Yep.
And surprise, surprise, magically you just corruption at that point.
I had that same problem. One of my first DBA gigs, true DBA gigs, was at Pilgrim's Pride. And they had SQL boxes, and these were 6.5 boxes, but still, right? They had SQL boxes in the kill rooms. And so it was just a SQL box sitting on a milk crate with a piece of plastic over it, covered in splatters of blood.
What?
And I was just like, you've got to be kidding.
Oh, so you talk about kill rooms. You're talking about they're killing turkeys in this?
Well, Pilgrim's Pride, they process chicken.
Oh, my God.
Oh, boy.
And they process, enterprise-wide, they process back then about 600,000 chickens an hour, 24/7.
Oh, my gosh.
So
And the servers are in the same room.
the server was in the same room because they have to weigh the chicken at every stage, right? So they want to know what the weight of feathers is, and then what the weight. Got to have a SQL box right there by the scales.
There you go. So because I feel like I'm going to be left out if I don't tell a story. Now, I can't tie it directly back to corruption. However, being from Richmond, Virginia, Philip Morris this is the headquarters for the tobacco industry. And it used to be, I think they've finally changed this policy, that because they were pro-tobacco people, you could smoke anywhere, even in the server rooms. And now they had pretty good ventilation systems, supposedly, but that was always the fun story that people would tell. So
How gross. So to go back to your question a little bit, we kind of got sidetracked a little bit, and it's just the nature of how I talk, right? I would say back to, who would benefit from using Minion. It's out of the gate when you install it. It installs with the job, it installs with schedule. So if you're not a very good DBA, you just hit the installer and it does everything and it'll be up and running and you'll have CheckDBs.
Okay.
But
Gotcha.
it's also configurable for like the world's greatest masters to come in there and tweak all the bells and whistles and get absolutely everything out of it they want. And one of the big advantages you get, especially with all the logging, right, is you get a history at your fingertips of all of the corruption you've ever had on that server and that database, on that table. And you can say, well, has this ever happened on this table before? And you can go back and look.
Right.
And it gives you a huge advantage as something that you don't get elsewhere. If you run the query to look at the last time database was CheckDB, right? SQL stores that information, right, on a page. But it doesn't store anything about check tables. So if you've got a database where you're even rotating check tables every month, and it takes you like 2 weeks or 4 weeks to get through all the tables, that database will show that it's never been CheckDB.
Exactly.
Even though it tables every month, and it takes you like 2 weeks or 4 weeks to get through all the tables, that database will show that it's never been CheckDB.
Exactly.
Even though it has. So having all of this here, you could easily query, oh, well, these tables were done here. And, when all of the tables have been done, you count that as a CheckDB. So you could write an SP that tells you, the last time it had a full CheckDB, which was, did all the tables get done last month? Or when's the last time all the tables got done? So SQL won't ever know it, but Minion will, right? And we're going to do more for that as we go through the versions. I mean, this was just version 1, and it was a very ambitious version. I mean, we've got so many features in there. One of the things I like about it the most is how, I hate to say something as corny as we crossed the finish line on a lot of these features, but say you're doing a remote CheckDB and you're restoring last night's backup. On the prod box, I'll show you in the log and the status column, and I'll even give you the % complete of the restore. And as it's doing the CheckDB on that remote server, I'll even give you the % complete of that CheckDB on the remote server here. So if you have 5 databases on prod 1, and they're all being remote CheckDB to 5 different servers, you'll see the status and get the results back on prod 1. You don't have to go around to all those different servers and check all that stuff manually, right? You get it back on prod where it belongs, because it's not, that's not a CheckDB of dev 1 or QA 1. It's a CheckDB of the prod 1 database. It just happens to be being run over there, right?
Right.
So the results belong back on prod 1. And when I want to see status, that status belongs back on prod 1. That's where I shouldn't have to go all over BFE to find this information.
Sure.
So
Yep.
I think we've crossed the finish line really well on some of that stuff like that, right? Really made it.
Sure. Okay. So I think that's a very in-depth answer to the question I asked, but definitely good stuff there. So
I never shut up about my products. You bought that.
oh yeah.
You knew I was a snake when you picked me up.
So I think that wraps it up for the questions we had to cover. Is there anything else you want to hit on before we move into the SQL family questions?
No, I better not. I'll just go and go and go. I'm still so incredibly in love with CheckDB. Well, I'm in love with 2 things. I'm in love with CheckDB as a product, and I'm in love with not having to be developing it anymore. It took me so long to write this, and I am just thrilled to be working on something else.
I thought it was available earlier, and you mentioned like shipping it out like last week or
February 1.
Oh, February 1. Yeah. So was that actually the first release?
Yes.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. So I guess I just been seeing this. So was that actually the first release?
Yes.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. So I guess I just been seeing the stickers or whatever previous to it.
Yeah, we teased it a little bit, and we had the stickers printed a long time ago because we knew it was going to be released. I just didn't know. God, it took me like a year and a half to finish it.
Gotcha.
Something like that. I mean, when I first started, it was like, hey, CheckDB, this will be easy because there's not nearly enough in there.
Sure.
There's not nearly as much in there as there was in backup. What could possibly go wrong?
Right.
But, then when you start adding multi-threading, and mind you, this is T-SQL multi-threading, right? I mean, I'm not breaking out into .NET or PowerShell or anything. This is all done in T-SQL.
Right.
So, we're doing multi-threading, and then the rotations, and then the remote stuff, and all it adds up. I'm way overcomplicate everything. So,
well, I heard an interesting, interesting thought, and talking with one of the Microsoft guys, and all this rapid release things that they talked about, and his comment was, "Releasing is a feature."
Yeah, I like that.
And I'm like, yeah, because you get, you just get kind of trapped like, oh, it's not good enough. It's not. It's not. No, you know what? Let's just release, and we'll fix it later.
All right, so let's go into the SQL family questions then.
Do it.
So how did you first get started with SQL Server?
I'll give you as short a version of the story as I can.
Okay.
So I was a French chef for many years and followed a French chef all around the world. And the latest bistro that we were in closed.
This is in France or this is in the States?
This was in the States.
Okay.
We were back here at that point. And I was like, man, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm not really looking forward to moving again because I was kind of tired of moving around. I didn't want to end up in a subpar hotel or something opening cans on the line. So one of the waiters said, well, my sister works for Stream. And I was like, okay, great. A field magazine. Great. And he goes, no, they do tech support. And I was like, what do I know about tech support? I'm a chef. And he says, well, they'll train you. And I was like, oh, really? So I had my own computer and ended up knowing a little bit more than I thought. And being in French kitchens and being who I am, a linguist and all of that, I ended up working for HP on the French line. I was French tech support for Windows for HP.
Interesting.
I stayed there for a while and then left there and went to this young startup called HealthWeb. It was a SQL-based product for healthcare where you could put all of your patient information up online. They were like one of the first ones that did this. Now it's everywhere, right? But they were one of the first ones that did this, and I was their tech. But they were one of the first ones that did this, and I was their tech support. Well, the application was written really well because the guy really knew what he was doing. And so most of the problems that we had ended up being SQL related.
Ta-da.
And this was like SQL 6.0 and 6.5. And so we had one customer at the time. They were hiring me ahead of time, right?
Sure.
And so I had nothing to do. And there was this whole wall of shelves in the back room with all of these computer parts on there. So I built 4 or 5 boxes and put them under my desk and networked them and just started learning SQL and IIS and Windows. And I didn't really know that much, right? But I had a guy there who, was willing to take the time to show me some stuff. He really mentored me. And so I just sat there all day long with the SQL training kits, the official training kits they give you for the cert exams back then,
Mm-hmm.
and just went through those things and worked all the examples and did them different ways. And every day when I came in, I would break all my boxes down, all the way down from Windows, and then reinstall Windows, reinstall SQL, create databases, load them with data, do the exercises, and do the same thing tomorrow because repetition is king, right? I worked there for like a year and a half or so, and every problem we ever had was always SQL related. It was never the application. and so they got sold, and they offered me a DBA job in Denver. And I was like, I just bought a house 2 weeks ago. What the hell am I moving to Denver? I just bought a house. You could have told me that you were selling the company 2 weeks ago.
Sure.
But it did plant a thought in my head because I had been looking for, when we found out about the sale, I had been looking for other help desk gigs because I was a help desk guy. That's what I was.
Sure.
Right.
When they came in a couple weeks later and said other help desk gigs, because I was a help desk guy. That's what I was.
Sure.
Right.
When they came in a couple weeks later and said, you could move to Denver and be a DBA, I can't move. But then I was like, hey, why don't I start looking for DBA gigs here? And I ended up getting hired on at Pilgrims and being a help desk guy with a lot of lab time under my belt and just a little bit of actual and no real production troubleshooting, no real production database running, just running it as a help desk guy, answering a question every now and then. And I was really pretty green, if you ask me. I mean, looking back on it, I was an idiot, right?
Sure. We all were. We've all been there.
We were all dumb in the mid-90s, right? I mean, he hired me on the spot. He said I was the best candidate they had ever seen. And I was like, really? Me? So I guess because I read the book, right? And the rest is history. I kind of fell into. So that's my story.
Now, we talked a little bit about this earlier. Perhaps we can revisit it. But if you could change one thing about SQL Server, what would it be?
Oh, geez, man. I would say the thing that's most important to me most of the time is they don't make the information as easy to get at as they think they do or as they like, right? Even when they do something to help somebody, like the new clone database thing, right?
Yep.
If you ask me, that kind of thing was kind of half-assed. I don't like the way they do most of the stuff. But anyway, I would say make the information easier to get at. Like, there is no reason whatsoever last CheckDB date shouldn't be in sys databases.
Right.
There is no reason why you can't have table properties and say the last check table date or something like that, right? So some of this information is just so incredibly hard to get at. Why is it so hard to get table size? Right? Why is it hard to get table size? Right? Why is it so hard to find some of this information, even the last time an SP was updated or the last time a table was written to or something? I mean, they don't make this stuff easy. You got to jump through some major hoops to get some of this stuff. So why isn't this stuff easier to get at? Why do we have to jump through so many hoops for basic information about the database, right? And I think CheckDB information, with it being the theme here, is the best example of that. Why Why do I have to do this ridiculous DBCC page thing and parse it and all of that crap to find out when the last time a database was? Why do I have to do this ridiculous DBCC page thing and parse it and all of that crap to find out when the last time a database was CheckDB? You know when it was. Put it in sys databases and move on. Another one is, why is it so hard to find out the last time a database was used? The last time somebody used a database or used a table or something like that to find out if the database is even still in use, right? SQL should be automatically keeping a list of all the applications that hit it so that you could easily query which applications have hit it and from what servers. That stuff shouldn't be a process that I have to write. SQL should just monitor these applications to be able to query SQL. Be able to lock anybody who's not a DBA out of every single access except through the intended application. I shouldn't have to buy a third-party product or write something really thick to do that for me. Right? I mean, SQL you should just have a list of applications that have connected, say, click, 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 add one. I want you to do this. I want you to add this one to it. And then that's it. For anybody who's not a DBA, DBAs can do whatever they want. But, don't let anybody hit it with Excel. Don't let anybody hit it with Crystal reports. Don't let anybody hit it with it, right? That's what that other box is for. This one is for this application, and that's it.
If you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why would you want it?
Oh, God. What did I say last time, Carlos? Do you remember?
I had to look it up.
Right now, I'm going to say I wish it's split between two. And I really can't decide which one. I would either want to be able to read minds, or I would want to be able to see details, by the way, not just this vague BS that you see in movies, but details into the reasonable future. I don't want to see vague shapes and colors and find out what that means as I get there. That's ridiculous. I want to be able to see a day or a week into the future and know what's going to happen and be able to be prepared. I mean, imagine in our field how cool that would be to know that a problem is coming and have seen the fix already and be able to do something about it.
Right.
You'd be a superstar in every sense of the word.
Yes,
Awesome.
and a very rich stock picker as well.
Yes, exactly. That hadn't crossed my mind, but yes, you get the point.
Oh, Warren Buffett, eat your heart out.
Yeah, I know, right?
Well, awesome. Sean, thanks so much for coming on the program today. It has been a blast as always.
Definitely been fun. Thanks, Sean.
I love this topic. Yeah, I know, right?
Well, awesome. Sean, thanks so much for coming on the program today. It has been a blast as always.
Definitely been fun. Thanks, Sean.
I love this topic. I'd like to see you guys again for Reindex 2.0
Yeah, of course.
starting now. And we didn't even get to talk about the new stuff in Minion Backup, but we'll save that for another one because, you guys
There you go.
You guys
Another 45 episodes or so.
Yeah, exactly. You can't make this the Sean show. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yes,
All right,
thanks,
thank you.
Thanks again, Sean. So again, we record these after the fact, but thinking back to that conversation with Sean, I'm sure that our listeners are laughing, and I can't stop laughing now.
Sean is one of the more entertaining guests that we've had.
That's right. That's right. And so my big takeaway from this conversation, and I don't know why, right? I guess because I'm a knuckle-dragging Neanderthal, but it didn't occur to me, or I did not know, was not familiar with that snapshot functionality with the DBCC CheckDB. And kind of thinking through that of what a snapshot is, it makes a lot of sense. It kind of makes that more clear as to what it's doing. And I found that very interesting.
Well, one of the reasons you may have not been familiar with it is because from SQL 2005 up to SQL 2012, although it did the snapshotting, it was completely hidden and you didn't know it was there. Where on SQL 2014 and newer, there are some files and some things around so you can actually see that a snapshot is occurring.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that's probably why, right?
Yep.
But again, one of those things, and now they've made that more available, and that's something that I'm sure Sean exposes in his tool, but something that, again, we'll need to keep in our repertoire as we think about how to use this in our environment.
Yep. Well, one of those things that I have completed and that they're successful, or if they've failed, that you know about it right away. And
Yes.
if you've got one SQL server, that's pretty easy to do and to know. But if you've got 50 or 100 or even more than that you have to monitor on a regular basis and be able to look at it and say, do I have all clean CheckDBs across all my databases? It's not always the easiest thing to do with dozens of SQL servers or hundreds of SQL servers.
No.
A very important thing to do to make sure you don't get corruption. Back to one of my favorite topics is
That's right.
and the sooner you can know about the problem, the more likely you are that you're able to fix the corruption when that occurs.
Right. And I think the default, my gut response originally there was, well, I'll have an alert or I'll have the notification set on the job so that it will fail. And well, I think, well, you should definitely have that. I'm not discounting that at all. It may not be completely acceptable. And it's almost kind of that who's watching the watchers effect, right? How many times have you opened up SQL Server Management Studio, seen a failed job, and then seen, oh, job failed, and then failed to notify operator, and you're like, oh, that hurts.
Yes, that happens more often than I'd like to admit.
Yeah, no, that's right. And so having a way to be able to, collect that, again, so Sean mentioned his tool, like PowerShell. And so having a way to be able to, collect that, again, so Sean mentioned his tool, like PowerShell, using PowerShell to go through the error logs, collecting that information, but kind of specifically looking for it rather than waiting for it to jump out, I think is another kind of key there.
Yep, absolutely.
So,
okay, well, I think that wraps it up.
The show notes for today's episode are available at SQLDataPartners.com/CheckDB.
Or at SQLDataPartners.com/episode number. And this is episode
90.
Our
music for SQL Server in the News is by Mansardian, used under Creative Commons. Thanks, everybody, for joining the conversation today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Again, if you want to give us feedback, you can reach out to us on Twitter. I am at Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am at SQL EMT. And we'll see you on the SQL
SQL Data Partners.